and get started. So this session is about doing immersive clinical experiences for engineers. And part of the motivation for doing this is a course that I've been teaching and running for the past, I think it's 7 years now, where we take students and rather than assigning them to a clinician in small groups and having them go in a handful of times with that clinician and seeing what the clinician wants the students to see, we take an approach that's more in keeping with human-centered design and design thinking. And we have a large group of students that go into an active clinical setting, an emergency department, and rather than telling them to solve a particular problem, we tell them, here's how you observe, here's how you identify problems, and we ask them to actually find real problems. Some of this comes from my experience first as an engineer, and as I started making the decision to go to medical school, I worked in a company that was building a medical educational simulator, and after a year and a half and $2 million worth of work, we did the demo, and the general, who was the surgeon who was from the sponsoring organization, walked into our demo, we turned it on, and he basically looked at it and goes, oh, this is completely wrong, and walked out of the room. And it was sort of at that moment that I realized, without ever having heard of anything like design thinking or human-centered design, that that was really important, that as designers, as engineers, we needed to actually be solving a real problem and understand the problem, rather than what we often do in design processes, particularly in healthcare, where we listen to people like me, to clinicians who say, here's my problem, and I want you to build and frequently we don't know what it is. The other challenge that I was very aware of was the issue of engineers understanding how to work in clinical environments. It's something that's hard to teach. All of us who've been to medical school or nursing school spend so much time in clinical environments. We know all the secret rules of how to behave. We know who's who. There's a lot of sort of innate knowledge that allows us to function in that space. And when engineers come in as very smart outsiders, things don't make sense. And frequently, they don't respond appropriately to that in a way that encourages ongoing collaboration. So the notion here was that we just take students, we teach them the basics of how to observe, and bring them into a clinical environment. And part of the reason to do that is, if I can figure out how to advance the slide here. So here's some limitations of kind of the conventional way. Limited clinical access, limited scopes for the observation, but the reality is that it's actually being there when scenes like this are unfolding, the unexpected moments when things go wrong, not being kicked out of the operating room when somebody says, oops, and actually seeing things that happen. Creates a great opportunity for engineers and engineering students to actually understand what we do in healthcare. To see things like this that emphasize not just one disease, one problem within disease, but larger issues in healthcare systems, and to have opportunities like this where you see somebody who has a problem and can actually say, what is the problem here? Tell me more about that, and start delving into solving issues that are there, that we know are there, but on a day-to-day basis, we frequently don't recognize. So that brings me to the rest of the panel. So this has been my course, but I've worked very closely with James Rains, who is one of my colleagues at Georgia Tech and runs our design for biomedical engineering, including our huge capstone course. And also comes to us from industry. We have Marybeth Privatera, who primarily industry background, but has been working in academic circles as well in this issue of observing in clinical settings and helping to drive design. And then Jorge Mena, who's actually one of my former students, who we invited along to share what it's like to be a student and have these experiences, and actually has developed something that he saw in this setting, and he can tell you more about that. Why don't we start with you? And
Sure. Well, as Dr. Ackerman said, I was a student. I took a class. I think that was back in 2014. I think this is on. I took the class back in 2014, and yeah, and going in, like the main project that I focused on was regarding ultrasound and efficiency and cleanliness in regards to the use of ultrasound gel and ultrasound probes. And that ultimately ended up leading to transferring that problem that I saw and applying it to the capstone class that I took right after the initial code class, and then ultimately ended up leading to an opportunity to create a startup and creating a company, which is ultimately what I'm working on right now concurrently as I am in medical school at the moment.
You guys want to talk a little bit about the impact of having students have observation experiences and bringing it back into design?
Yes. All right. So it's really important for the students when they're working on projects. So I run the senior design. When they're working on projects, to make sure that they are gaining empathy of all the users that are involved in this. We get students partnered with physicians, and physicians always say, listen to me. I know this more than anybody. Just do what I say, and what comes out is going to be amazing. And so it's really hard to convince the surgeon that, no, the students really need to talk to all the people involved in it, especially the patients. You heard a lot about talks yesterday and today about putting a focus on the patient. And so we make sure that the students are talking to everybody, not just the physician, but also the nurses, the scrub techs, the purchasers, patients, to really get a perspective from all the different angles. And when they do that, you see a big difference in what they come up with versus if they're just trying to solve the problem per what the physician told them.
So I'm not from Georgia Tech. I'm from Cincinnati, and I have a foot, as Dr. Ackerman pointed out, I have a foot in industry and a foot in academia. So I both work as a professional designer, and then I also work as a associate professor in biomedical engineering. And I'm essentially University of Cincinnati's counterpart to what James does at Georgia Tech, and I run the design capstone there. And just building on what James said, it's really important to not only understand the entire ecosystem of how a device arrives at the hospital, how it's used, how it's disposed of, but it's also important to get a range of opinions. So one of the things that we do in industry, in our industry practices, are to go and look at that and say, okay, Dr. So and Dr. X in this institution did it this way, but what's going on in Seattle? What's going on in Europe? Because almost every medical device is a global device. So having a system and teaching young engineers to go out and observe is the first step, and then having a system of analyzing that data and making sense out of that is the second one, and then broadening it out so that you're not designing for the super ego of I know it all. I have the greatest device in the world, and it becomes the Dr. Julia's vascular or whatever it is, but it becomes something that's that a broad audience wants it to be. And that's no offense to those physicians that have those ideas. Those are the kernels of it. It's all in the effort to make something better, something usable, something that a broad audience is going to want to use and be successful in that marketplace.
So I guess I'll continue with a question for you. And part of why I wanted you to be on the panel is literally so I could pick your brain about these things. So in working with industry, in being a part of industry and having teams go out there, what is important that they need to learn before they get out there in industry as opposed to when they're students?
That's a great question. And we've alluded to the fact that when you go into the practice of medicine as an engineer, as a designer, as a non-trained clinical faculty member or member of staff, you're not sure of what's going on. So knowing simple things, where you stand, how to, don't take your giant bag, wear comfortable shoes, what's appropriate shoes, do you eat, do you not eat? What do you do when you feel sick? I always tell the students, someone passes out in my classroom every single year. It's already happened this year, so I'm good. It's just one. But what are the signs for that? And so those are like the 101. That's the basics. And that's something that I think, courses at Cincinnati, courses at Hopkins, courses, James, that teaches them. But there's also a knowledge of when do you ask questions. If we sit back and we are simply a fly on the wall, then we're likely to come up with a misinterpretation of what's going on. If you take a look, for example, at interventional cardiology, everything is under a sheet. It goes into the femoral artery, a catheter does, and it goes up and it does something in the heart, and you're not even looking at your hands. And so unless I have someone to explain that to me, I won't understand what exactly is going on. Now, who do I ask? Who's the best person to in that room to ask? And what's the behavior? So it's that when do I ask, who do I ask, and then what questions do I ask when I'm there? There's also something else that happens with industry, and that is engineers tend to be a little bit shy, and they also tend to have ideas that they want to explore. And that's a great thing, but you have to start off with what am I watching before I get into the ideation and the co-creation with the individual person. Because if I jump into ideation with them, I might be throwing them off course because they're in their world of practice. And in their world of practice, so last time you were working in the ED, I'm sure you weren't brainstorming about what you could possibly be doing with this patient that had, you know, a gunshot wound. You were treating the patient, right? So
Yes.
you only have at that moment, you only have the tools that are available to you. So asking them to blue sky and think about something right on the fly is probably not a good question. But asking them about what challenges that they have while they're doing their task is a good question. The other challenge that industry has, quite honestly, is they don't appreciate, some of them don't appreciate the fact that we are a guest in someone's house. And I think that becomes problematic. And what I mean by that is if I am a higher up in marketing and maybe I start looking at my cell phone, well, in some cultures, that's really offensive. You do that on a break. In Japan, if you sit down before the physician sits down, you're now offensive. So what behaviors and what constitutes behavior gets to that offensiveness? And once I've offended during a clinical visit, I can't really move beyond and get to their true needs and to their true challenges. So I want to develop that relationship. So it spans the gamut from the 101, how do I behave, to when do I ask the questions to get the information, to when do I brainstorm, to what behaviors do I do that may potentially be offensive to them.
I was just going to add to that is really about the questions, you know, because really getting the voice of the customer, it's really important how you're posing your questions, because a lot of times people will lead the witness, if you will, and they'll say, is it really difficult when you squeeze that trigger and the thing doesn't come out? And wouldn't it be better if you could do blah, blah, blah? So you really want to prevent that from happening, and having them narrate what they're doing is really very beneficial. Explain to you what is the algorithm for why they're doing that procedure versus another step in the procedure, and then just getting them to talk. So it's always getting them, asking them open-ended questions just to have them talk, share the experience, their knowledge with you, and not leading them to a specific solution. And so I think that's really, really key. So it's listening 90 to 80% of the time, and you're talking about 10 or 20% of the time. So very minimal talking, all listening.
So Jorge, how did that play out for you? Since you're the one who, you know, I've thrown out this construct and you were subjected to it. Now you've heard a little bit more about what people think you should have gotten out of it, which I would tend to agree with everything that was said. But I mean, do you feel like you got that? How did that work exactly?
No, I think that what we're talking about, and like specifically not going in and just trying to give the witness already like a thing and try to like just lead them to like our solution, but more of like really just coming in there with open mind, just like, yeah, let's do a lot of questions. Let's just really understand this problem very well. And we're not going in there creating advice. We're in there trying to identify specifically where like the gap is and what the problem is and what's really going on in here, because then you can actually use all these things to actually create a solution that will like solve all the possible problems rather than just a specific thing that you first saw. Because that's at first when we were first observing the problem that I identified during the class, which in regards to cleanliness, we like discovered a whole bunch of other things just talking to different nurses and seeing like when the patient was coding, like, oh, there was no gel in the machine. You had to run over to a room because the gel had run over, and that was another problem we had in Envision at first. So there were many different things that you were able to actually learn rather than just that initial observation that you could potentially have made, and that end up leading you to like creating a much more comprehensive solution that will solve the problems, not just that one problem that maybe someone had mentioned you about that you've initially observed, but problems that affect a much larger group of people.
And then you've obviously worked with Jorge and other students that have been through this process on Capstone. Have you seen differences in how that plays out with the student teams or effects of having had an experience that was not focused on solving a particular problem or building a specific device?
All right, so for the students that I get, so I'm like the last class that they take before they graduate, and they'll take Jeremy's class normally at like a sophomore, junior level.
Supposed to be junior.
Junior level primarily. And so you really see a big difference in the students who come in and are ready to start off that phase of the class, because we spend the first third of it trying to understand the problem, right, really deeply. And the students who have done all this observation and they know how to talk to the patients or to the different users, they do a much better job of being aggressive, getting out there and learning more about the problem. Because that's the big hurdle, is having the students make sure that they're solving the right problem. Because we give them general problems to start off with, but they need to go out there and verify that that's right. And so the students who have taken the class have that confidence, and they already know the strategy that they're going to implement in trying to go out and learn more about the problem.
So it looks like we've roughly doubled the number of folks in the room since we started. So I think I'm going to rewind a little bit, since many of you have heard bits and pieces about this course that I'm running. Some of you may have been attracted by the scalable and all of that. So if you have a question, I'm happy to answer a question.
In your first time around, you never actually explained how the course works, so maybe we do that a little more. And then
It sounded like a perfect introduction to talk about that a little more.
conflict is between your microphone and the
Oh. Yeah, there we go. We had talked about this, throughout the talk, just removing layers of clothing. It's complicated, but we'll keep the clothing in place and just move the microphone. So the way the course is functionally structured, to some degree, the way the course works is we take students and we throw them into an active emergency department. It is a course that is pitched to the students as being a design course. But in order to get into how to do design thinking and human-centered design, at some level, I would argue it is a creative writing and anthropology course. Okay, so we have our emergency departments, and in fact, we're using multiple emergency departments. A total of 4 emergency departments in 3 different healthcare systems. There's another healthcare system we worked with as well. And what that lets us do is send small groups of students to each healthcare system, each emergency department, and actually have each student go to more than one site and then come back together in small groups and in the class and get a common didactic experience. In terms of the content of the course, before we send them off into the hospitals, we teach them very basic things about how to behave in healthcare. So this past week, I did my lecture about HIPAA, hand washing, and what to do if you feel like you're going to get sick. Okay, and it's one of those things you have to do. I'm running a very large number of students through. It's been about 6 years since I've actually had a student pass out, which is pretty good, but every semester I usually get a phone call from one of my colleagues who goes, one of your students is here and they're sitting in the hallway with their head between their knees and they look a little pale. And I'm like, yeah, they're doing exactly what I told them to do. If they actually pass out, give them a hand, but if they're doing okay, just keep on doing what you're doing. It'll be all right. So we give them that very basic, what do you get in there? How do you behave? I teach them the very basics about how to start doing observation. And whether it's sort of fly on the wall, I'm standing there and recording what's going on, or as they get a more focused question and actually start interviewing the physicians, the nurses, the patients, some of that is a skill that they have to learn for themselves. They bring to the class and to their observation their own personalities. And that's often something that they struggle with a little bit, is how do I start interviewing my potential end users? How do I find out more about what's going on? Part of how the process also works is in class, much of our class time, once they're in the clinical setting, I walk into the room with no PowerPoint, no planned lecture, and get in front of 60 students who collectively have spent 200 hours that week in emergency departments, and say, what did you see that you wish your classmates had seen? What did you see that you didn't understand? What would you like to learn more about? And so the students then will say things like, well, I was in the trauma bay and somebody came in and I think they were shot, and Then the surgeon put on a gown and grabbed this flexible thing, and I think they shoved it in their chest. Okay, I have to take a deep breath there and go, okay, what was this? Well, that sounds like they did a tube thoracostomy in a trauma patient. And it becomes an opportunity to layer in a good bit of anatomy, physiology, procedures, how we manage patients, introducing some of the different roles in the trauma bay, and throw a lot of the language of how we as clinicians talk about what happens in healthcare. But in that teachable moment, one of my classmates saw somebody who was shot, and then this thing happened, and they heard the description of the events. So that's what the students are ready to understand. And then they hear my description of it. Different perspective, different language. I'm speaking the language that they need to be building up to start asking better questions. So we do that throughout the class. The creative writing part, you mentioned the word empathy as part of the design process. And empathy is something that is a little bit challenging as part of the design, particularly when the people you're designing for are very different from you. And a number of years ago, I actually started asking the students to write stories about what they're seeing. And part of that was simply to have them try to put themselves inside the head of a doctor or a nurse, a patient, and try to figure out what that would be like. And then to challenge them a little bit to go back and figure out if what they were thinking that person was thinking was actually what they were thinking. And particularly in the case of putting themselves in the heads of the providers, trying to understand why their thinking of what we were thinking was actually wrong. And so that's something that all the students tend to dig in a little bit when I say, next week you've got to write me a story. And they all kind of go, but it's something that they start learning to roll with a little bit. It also becomes a part of how they describe the problems that they found and actually sort of pitch their problems.
So just a comment, you know, the one piece in there that we have to hone in on is the use of medical terminology. Because that's one of the things that I don't think that anyone that is not necessarily trained in the medical profession is really quite comfortable or confident, and we know the impact of that. So for example, if we're interviewing a physician, we're interviewing a nurse, and we use the wrong, especially physicians, surgeons, if we use the wrong terminology, you're done. You've lost all credibility, and you can't get to the depth of the conversation. And at least from industry's perspective, you can't get to the depths to the science to understand the root cause without using that appropriate technology. So there's a fair amount of preparation that goes on before an industry counterpart goes out, especially if their name is on, if they're wearing scrubs or something, or they're identified, because the last thing they would want is to be talking to their customer. You're always the customer, and not have that level of science and that level of degree. So the conversations that you're having with the young students that say, feel comfortable and use it when you come back into the design studio, when you're coming back into the design lab, when you're talking to yourself, don't say the bendy thing on the back of the heart, say left atrial appendage, you know, call it what it is, and keep using those words and correct each other so that it becomes in your everyday vernacular, because it's not a comfortable thing to say.
Yeah, I think my students have a huge advantage over coming in from industry, because most of the ERs that our students are going to, we've been having students come in for a while. Most of the staff knows these are undergraduate engineering students, so there's sort of a little bit of a lowered expectation that I consistently get feedback by the end of the semester. People start saying, wow, I had a really neat conversation with your students about, and they use the right words. So it's one of those, they start out and they're definitely using all the wrong words, but with having so much time there, with getting feedback, and if you want to talk about our process of pitching, sort of pitching and describing the problems and some of the getting feedback, there is a process of actively getting feedback on how they're describing the problems and how they talk about the problems.
Yeah, so first I wanted to add how important it was actually to have the people in the hospital be aware of who you are. Oftentimes when we'd first come in, if there were doctors that were not aware of what we were doing, it would really like interfere with like the process of the observation. They would always be like unsure why you were there, where you were like like someone who was like writing them or taking notes on them, who was like potentially working for the hospital, a consultant, and that can interfere sometimes with that process. But it also, whenever they were aware and they actually were interested in this whole process, they would make things so much more like they would actually tell you what they were doing. And we just got both of the parties like participating and figuring out what was it that wasn't working well. For the process of pitching, we actually something that we did for the class, which was really cool and actually taught us in the long run to actually be more comfortable presenting and different problems. We had like a Pecha Kucha style of presentations where we had to like really quick like narrow it down to the most important things and give a short presentation on the problems we identified. And then we get feedback from the professors, the entire class, and I thought, I mean, that would fix and they would ask more questions that actually open up different ideas that we potentially hadn't explored, and I think that was extremely helpful also for that.
I think that's probably, yeah. I think we have about 10 minutes left to try to get roughly back on schedule, and I'm guessing some of you have some more questions. So why don't we see if there are any questions out there? Yep.
All right, your business model, starting with the process and where you go. So at the moment, so just to give you a little bit of what we actually came up and the like our final product. So we created a solid polymer pad that would eliminate the need for liquid ultrasound gel because it acts as your coupling media. So the idea for the product is you take your ultrasound probe and you imagine like a Band-Aid that you peel off an adhesive liner and you slap your pad on your probe, and the addition of another surface on the other side, which is slippery, allows you to perform those procedures without the need for having to mess around with all the gel and reapply gel. And by the time you're done, you simply peel it off, throw it away, so you have a clean probe. Your patient doesn't have all that gook all over them. And ultimately, you fix different problems in efficiency, cleanliness, and patient comfort at the same time. So that's where we are right now. We have like pivoted in different ways based on like different things that we have learned as we have gone from like different stakeholders, prices, and how hospitals do different things. At the moment, we're really focusing in on actually the use for therapeutic ultrasounds, which has been a little different from what we initially intended for diagnostic. But it's stuff that we have learned along the way, and actually like having this specific process of observation and really understanding the problem very well has allowed us to like actually whenever we sit down with someone who asks us all these different questions, we actually have a lot of our bases covered. And like I said, going back, right now we're working a lot with therapeutic ultrasound for whenever you need to apply ultrasound for large periods of time in a specific area. Let's say if it's high intensity focused ultrasound for repairing injuries or for delivering medication or for altering different membranes, and you need like an ultrasound coupling medium that will stay there immobile for a while and would not like smear all over. That's a lot of the places where we're actually in right now and the people we're working with. Cool. Now think about all the different footprints that you have to deal with. You're not customizing for every single product. So yeah, and that's okay. So that's one issue we've had. Like there's a lot of different like ultrasound probes out there that like not just from like one brand can have like 3 different styles of probes, but like you have across all the different brands, like all the probes are slightly different in their footprint, which is where the ultrasound waves come out from. And that's something that we're still working on, like as we go, because depending on the user, like so let's say therapeutic ultrasounds have very different size probes, and that's one of the things that we're still work on, and we do more observations and we test and we bring it to the customer, and they give us their opinion on what they think should be fixed and how we can modify them. But we hope to make a universal product that can be used for like the largest amount of probes, but we ultimately will end up like having specific like size product for different probes, which ultimately can help with our business model.
Yes, go ahead. So this is a good example of ending up at the right place a little bit by blind luck, a little bit by intention. When I joined the faculty at Emory, there was a course that brought students into one of our emergency departments that's based on a model of basically using undergraduate students as free research assistants. So we taught a course on clinical research methods and had them going into the ER to help us do studies. And I was co-teaching that course with another faculty member who got a huge NIH grant and said, why don't you take over the course? There was funding from biomedical engineering as part of the endowment from the Coulter Foundation that was paying for it. And right at the time of that switch, the department came to me and said, you know, this clinical research methods course, the endowment says it's supposed to be an engineering-oriented clinical experience, clinical research, not engineering-oriented. If you want the money that we're paying you so that you can spend time teaching rather than seeing patients, you need to change your course. And I had actually just participated with a colleague in the College of Architecture at Georgia Tech in co-teaching a course that really prominently featured human-centered design. It's a bit of an epiphany for me because it was a formalized way of doing what I had sort of come to learn seemed to be a better way of doing design than anything I'd been formally taught. And I literally said, well, human-centered design is based on observation. I've already know how to get students into this really cool place to observe things, and I really want to be teaching. So I wrote a 3-sentence course proposal that basically said, human-centered design is a thing. I've got ERs that the students can go in, so we'll send them into the ERs and teach them how to do human-centered design. And that's where the course started out. The clinical research methodology course was incredibly popular before I came to it. The students would affectionately call it the Grady Course because it was Grady Memorial Hospital that they went to, an urban ER where all these pictures are from. And so the popularity and student buy-in was never really a problem. The bigger problem has been making sure that we've had enough ongoing support to pay for my time as things like credentialing students has gotten more complicated, making sure that we're able to still get through those things, have the administrative and financial support to get them in. And that's part of the issue with scalability. We started with 18 students. We now have 60 students per semester. The big part of this is having a setup with the classroom and places to send the students where you can take a large number of students with a relatively small number of clinicians who are actively involved in teaching. And so we've evolved, as I've gotten better at teaching this, we've been able to expand the course out. And we're really at a point that if I had either more money for my time or for additional clinicians, there are probably 2 more clinical sites that we could do. And we probably could be running about 100 to 120 students per semester. So it's been an evolution. It was not something that we started and knew exactly where we were going. It's just worked really well. As I've taught it, as I've gotten feedback from folks downstream, I make changes constantly.
It doesn't actually.
There is no NIH support for this. One of my pet peeves about NIH in this is there's been a small number of calls for proposals for clinical immersion. And the amount of money and the scale of the programs, in my opinion, much too small.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah.
The R25 mechanism in NIH will fund it. They just don't fund big places that have giant grants from the Coulter Foundation.
And in context, we're talking about $50,000 a year is what we've been.
But you know, to the point though of I think what Dr. Ackerman has done is fantastic and is scalable, but it doesn't actually have to cost a lot of money. The reality is that if you have physicians, I think physicians in particular, there's a out of 100 physicians, there's probably 25 or 50 of them that are interested in developing medical devices. Of them, 10% of those or 20% of those probably can find the time to carve out that are really truly motivated, that want to work and improve and are innovators that want to do it. And they will collaborate because they're interested and they have a vested interest in doing it. So at University of Cincinnati, where we're less resourced, we do have an R25, but that covers the prototyping. It doesn't cover the immersion experience, but that same mechanism will cover the immersion experience. The challenge that we have is we're a cooperative education program, so the funding doesn't compensate as well as the cooperative education. So we would never get students to sign up for it because they would make $1,000 from NIH or $7,000 for a semester from Boston Scientific. So it's a no, you know, it's not a good mechanism, not a good fit for us. My point though is that if you have a willingness to collaborate, we should. In industry practices, we don't always compensate when we go out and we observe and we have those collaborators. Yes, there's several that are on the clinical advisory boards or they're key contacts, but we're not always compensating the physicians that we're interviewing. They're volunteering their time or we're giving an honorarium to the institutions. The process of going and doing clinical immersion in order for medical devices to actually be fit to the users is something that should be propagated regardless of whether or not it just makes sense to do it.
Yeah, and I will say that the scalability part of the little bit of a difference here of opinion is I agree 100% we need these clinical opportunities. My argument about scalability is simply that if you have a small number of clinicians who are really good at doing it, rather than what we often have done in education is we work with them once or twice, don't pay the clinicians for their time, and then they disappear after working with small students. Our model, because we had the luxury of that money to start out with to keep me involved so I didn't have to go and see patients, we've been able to build up a structure where we can take care of a lot of students, provide a lot of immersive experience very rapidly. Certainly in a smaller scale, you can do it, and you really should, and I think you would agree that some of the more open-ended observation for students is.
The system that you have, though, provides a much more mentorship, and I think that that's the key point and the key learning, because when they are volunteering their time, they have to maybe wait 3 months before you get someone, whereas they're available to you to ask those questions. And to the point of being intimidated in a clinical environment, I may not ask as many dumb questions, but if I know that Dr. Ackerman is available later, I'm going to save that question and I'm going to ask him when he's in the classroom. So it's a mentorship thing. It happens.
One of your questions, too, is about students' interest in the class, and it's one of our 2 most popular classes that's taken, so it gets filled up really quickly. And so the students love it, and then we as faculty like it for when they go on into our other classes. It pays off.
I think let's just do one more question, and that way we leave time for you to go in for the next session here.
It's an amazing program from the engineering, from the school side of things. For those of us interested in kind of starting this program, what kind of value proposition do you give to the clinics themselves? Like, what benefit do they see letting a bunch of unruly undergraduates into their emergency rooms with all the liabilities involved? What do you come say to the hospital? Like, hospital, I want to let my students go play in your ER room. Not play, but get immersed and experienced in your ER.
So in starting this, this was a very slight change from a clinical research program, which obviously that was the value proposition that we initially were offering. Over time, what's happened is these students, we often still do use them for research, although increasingly they're used for quality improvement projects, which in terms of my course is actually great. The hospital says we need more information about an actual problem. So out of the 4 hours that you're here, you're going to spend a half an hour, looking at people's workflow and getting timestamps to measure something. So it actually gets the students both good exposure, forces them to think about a problem that somebody else says is real and validates it, and lets the hospital get some free data. Most of our sites, the way we got them in initially was the way most clinical experiences historically have happened, which is I'm a doctor and they're with me and I said so. Which increasingly the barriers to getting credentialing are getting harder, and so the question of value proposition is getting to be bigger. Within Emory Healthcare, we've made a lot of inroads in saying, look, they're doing quality improvement sorts of things. With Grady Hospital, in fact, it is part of Grady's educational mission, and that's been a kind of an easy sale. We recently started working with Kaiser Permanente of the Southeast, and the value proposition there actually was they're looking for avenues to start collaborations to prevent physician burnout. And so having the students there, having smart students who are like, yeah, if you've got an idea when I'm in capstone, I completely want to work with you, to them actually is a bit of something. To a degree, they came to us and said, what can we do together? finding the sweet spot, dealing with these barriers to credentialing, and figuring out where the weak point where you can get in and make things happen is quite challenging.
We'll produce visual maps of the procedures, and then that goes back to the clinical departments in order to be used in training. And that's of value to them. So if we can say, what we'll do to you is we'll follow 6 fellows for the year. We'll go through and do analysis, quite a bit of analysis on the variances of techniques, and not necessarily say one is better than the other one, but illustrate them. Then that's an immediate win. If you get to the point where you're saying we're going to develop intellectual property, you're probably going down the wrong path, because it's so far long to get to anything that's commercializable that it's a problem.
Yeah. Some of the things the students uncovered, there was an issue about bed sheets that potentially saved the hospital about $70,000 a year, that students kind of mapped it out very nicely. My students have found multiple HIPAA violations that they're like, whoa, this piece of paper is going and it's used in a way that it's potentially problematic. So that also has been helpful to be able to go and take those reports that the students write describing problems and say, this got handed up the chain of command, and a real problem that you had in the hospital was fixed as a result of having the students there. Yeah, I think all of us would love to talk to everybody kind of offline, but we do need to try to keep the whole meeting going along. So, we're all happy to meet with you at some point over the course of the meeting. I think our contacts are all in the program.